initiating a flexible opening, developing a knight to a central square, and keeping options open for pawn structures. Asserting central space immediately challenges white's flexible opening, demanding a clear plan for piece development and pawn structure. Preparing a fianchetto, this maneuver seeks long-term kingside influence and a solid pawn structure. Solidifying the center's pawn structure is the immediate aim, creating a robust pawn chain for future development. Developing the bishop to this diagonal creates immediate pressure along the A8-H1 diagonal, aiming for black's queenside pawns. Developing the bishop outside the pawn chain prepares for central control and potential kingside pressure. Opening up lines for piece development, white challenges black's pawn structure and aims for queenside space. Solidifying the center and preparing for development, this move opens lines for the queen and bishop while maintaining pawn structure integrity. Opening lines with this capture immediately contests black's pawn structure and opens avenues for quick piece development. Reclaiming the center pawn solidifies black's central presence and aims to neutralize white's aggressive pawn push. Placing the queen here immediately targets the pawn on b7, forcing black to react and potentially disrupt their developing scheme. Protecting the d5 pawn while simultaneously eyeing white's queenside, this maneuver subtly pressures the c3 square and prepares for potential pawn advances, aiming to solidify black's central presence. Eliminating the queen simplifies the position, shifting focus to piece activity and pawn structure. White forfeits immediate attacking pressure for potential endgame advantages, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive bishop placement. This trade opens up the d-file and creates opportunities for rook development. Opening the f-file for potential pressure, this capture reconfigures black's pawn structure, creating an isolated queen's pawn on b6 that could become a target, but also granting immediate access to open space. Developing the knight to c3 now solidifies central influence and prepares for potential kingside castling, all while eyeing the d5 pawn for future pressure. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's central presence and prepares for the potential pawn push e5, aiming to contest the center more directly and gain space on the queen side. Solidifying the center and preparing for a pawn advance, d3 repositions a piece for active defense and potential kingside development, setting the stage for a positional battle rather than an immediate tactical brawl. Developing the knight to f6 neatly prepares castling, while simultaneously reinforcing the d5 pawn and preventing immediate queenside pressure. Safeguarding the king is paramount in this evolving structure, allowing white to connect the rooks and prepare for central pawn advances or knight redeployments. Preventing bg5 oppressive pin, this move offers a touch of breathing room for the king side. While it creates a slight weakness on g6, it's a necessary concession to avoid more immediate tactical discomfort and prepares for future knight maneuvering. It also subtly opens the h-file for potential later use. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal after castling, this maneuver aims to enhance piece activity and exert pressure along the long diagonal, potentially targeting weaknesses on black's queenside or preparing for an eventual central expansion. Assertively placing the bishop on c5 activates it, eyeing the queenside and preventing white from comfortably expanding with b4, while simultaneously reinforcing black's central pawn structure and preparing for potential d4 thrusts. Securing the queenside flank with a pawn advance, this move subtly prevents black's bishop from finding a comfortable outpost on b4 and simultaneously prepares to expand white's influence on the queenside. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield is a prudent step, reinforcing the safety of the black king and preparing for potential central skirmishes or a more active middle game. Asserting control over the central open file, the rook prepares to dominate the position, potentially creating pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and dictating the tempo of the game as the middle game unfolds. Securing the open c-file, black's rook now pierces the center, directly challenging white's queenside presence and creating immediate tension for control of that crucial pathway. The knight now aims to occupy a crucial outpost on b5, eyeing the weak b6 pawn and potentially disrupting black's queenside structure. Reorienting the knight to the kingside creates a flexible pawn structure, offering potential support for a future kingside pawn push or a rerouting of pieces towards the critical central squares. Boldly pushing the queenside pawn signals white's intention to seize more territory and create attacking chances on that flank, potentially cramping black's pieces and establishing a strong foothold. A welcome consolidation of black's pieces, bringing the bishop back to a more passive diagonal but preparing to support a queenside pawn push. Rerouting the rook to the center opens up avenues for future action, aiming to challenge black's control of the e-file and prepare for a potential kingside push or even a tactical strike down the half-open file. Launching pawns forward with g5 undeniably injects dynamism, but at what cost to king's safety and piece harmony? While it aims to disrupt white's bishop placement and potentially expand on the kingside, this aggressive stride creates immediate weaknesses that can be exploited by judicious piece play, particularly if black underestimates the defensive integrity of their pawn shield and the potential for white's pieces to penetrate. Gaining initiative on the queenside by challenging black's bishop offers a potent way to exploit the now open diagonal for white's light-squared bishop. This repositioning of the knight aims to challenge white's bishop pair and potentially liberate black's queenside pawns, seeking to exploit the open a-file and the weakened light squares on white's kingside. The knight embarks on a fascinating journey to the center, aiming to disrupt black's poised queenside pawn structure and potentially threaten the lightly defended kingside if black isn't careful. This maneuver signals white's intent to seize central initiative and exploit the slight awkwardness of black's knight on e8, which is currently blocking its own pawn chain. It's a flexible repositioning, capable of supporting attacks on either flank or even pivoting towards central control should the opportunity arise, a true chameleon in this evolving positional battle. The knights exchange, simplifying the position but potentially opening lines for white's queen and rooks on the queenside. Black's intention might be to prevent white's knight from reaching a more active outpost, perhaps on c7, and to gain some breathing room on the queenside, though the pawn structure there is now slightly compromised by the doubled b-pawns after the earlier exchanges. Reclaiming the knight on d4 unlocks central influence and prepares to challenge black's pieces, aiming to disrupt the coordination of the black queenside majority and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king if black isn't careful with pawn pushes. Seeking to dislodge the knight and open lines towards the kingside, the bishop repositions to a more active square, eyeing the queenside pawns and potentially preparing for a later advance or exchange that could simplify the position or create imbalances. The exchange sacrifice here initiates an endgame where control of the open, c-file becomes paramount, potentially offering white an advantage if they can coordinate their pieces effectively and exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure on the queenside. Reclaiming the central file after the exchange solidifies black's presence, preparing to challenge white's slightly awkward knight placement and potentially activate the queenside pawns by advancing the b-pawn. Re-establishing control of the crucial central file now becomes paramount, especially after that sequence of exchanges, which has simplified the position. Black's rook now asserts control over the file, a key pathway opening up after the exchanges, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create mating threats on the back rank if white's king's safety is compromised. Asserting dominance over the 7th rank, the rook penetrates black's position with surgical precision, aiming to dismantle the defensive structure and create persistent threats along that crucial horizontal. The king's journey toward the center begins, a bold step to activate a dormant piece and potentially claim vital central squares as the rooks contest the open file. Repositioning the knight from the active c2 square to its original square on d4 reestablishes a strong central presence and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while simultaneously defending the e4 square. That bishop's retreat to d8, while seemingly passive, effectively shores up the d7 pawn and prepares for potential king activity on the queenside later. The rook's return to the 3rd rank aims to challenge black's asserted control of the c-file and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queen side, subtly shifting the strategic battleground from pure file control to a more dynamic pawn struggle with underlying piece coordination. Exploring the cramped queenside territory with the knight now seems like a plausible, albeit somewhat passive, attempt to reactivate the piece after its retreat. Retreating the rook from the active c-file acknowledges black's control and repositioning of the knight, aiming to secure the piece and possibly prepare a counterthrust on the queen side where the pawn structure is less developed. Regaining control of the open c-file represents black's immediate priority, aiming to disrupt white's rook dominance and prevent any further encroachment. The rook retreats, a strategic repositioning to bolster the queenside pawn structure against further pressure and prepare for a potential pawn advance on the b-file, aiming to cramp black's pieces. Reorienting the bishop to a more active square, aiming to contest the dark squares and potentially threaten the d3 pawn, is a sound repositioning. Clearing a path for the rook to potentially support the pawn's advance is a key idea here. A daring thrust into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's solid pawn structure and create immediate counterplay on the queen side. Unpacking the center with that piece exchange opens up the long diagonal for your remaining bishop, creating an immediate threat towards black's isolated queen's knight pawn. The capture on c3 decisively uncovers the d8 rook, aiming to reintegrate it into the fray and contest the open c-file, a crucial pathway for black's counterplay. Pivoting the bishop to the active diagonal aims to redeploy forces and create new avenues of attack, potentially targeting weaknesses that have emerged around black's king after the recent exchanges. Black's rook now finds itself on an active post, challenging white's pawn structure and potentially disrupting the queenside coordination. Consolidating the king's safety becomes paramount, shielding it from potential pawn storms or rook intrusions that the open b-file might facilitate. The bishop retreats, seeking a safer square, but its departure from the open diagonal now allows white's rook to dominate the c-file entirely. Securing that queenside expansion pathway opens up intriguing counterplay for white, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses on black's potentially isolated pawns should that pawn advance further. The bishop repositions, seeking better diagonal influence, but this allows the rook to gain an unchallenged foothold on the third rank, potentially pressuring the king's defenses. Unlocking potential on the queen side, white's pawn thrust aggressively probes black's pawn structure, aiming to create weaknesses and gain extra space. This advance forces a decision from black regarding the b-pawn and could potentially open lines for white's rooks and bishop. Seizing this open line now offers a chance to dismantle white's pawn chain, though be mindful of the bishop's current placement, which might become a target if white can mobilize their rook more effectively. Clearing the b-file allows the rook to become a much more active participant, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure on white's queen side. Reclaiming the initiative, black repositions the bishop to the more active c5 square, putting immediate pressure on white's vulnerable a4 pawn and preparing to challenge white's queenside pawn majority. The knight now has a wonderfully active post, eyeing the vulnerable black king and threatening to create a passed pawn on the queen side as the exchange of material simplifies into a potentially winning endgame. Black recaptures the pawn, re-establishing material equality, but bringing their rook to a more active square from which it can eye the white king's defenses and potentially threaten the d-pawn. Focusing on the unleashed potential of the queenside pawns, this advancement seeks to exploit the current static nature of black's pieces by initiating a pawn storm towards white's relatively exposed monarch, aiming to create dynamic imbalances. A curious repositioning, aiming to solidify the pawn chain and potentially contest the open file, though it concedes valuable tempo for maneuvering on the queen side. The rook's relocation to the second rank establishes a crucial defensive outpost, preventing the opponent's bishop from further incursions and preparing for potential pawn advances on the queen side. Liberating the pawns allows the rook to potentially swing over to the queen side, seeking activity against white's isolated pawns. Consolidating the pawn structure along the queen side, This maneuver aims to create a more solid defensive formation after the preceding exchanges, potentially preparing a more coordinated advance or simply solidifying White's position before any decisive action. The monarch abandons its protected island and ventures toward the center, signaling a shift toward potential pawn clashes and a more active endgame where king's safety will be a paramount concern. Repositioning the rook from the queen side to the king side aims to contest control of the central files and potentially support an e4 pawn push, injecting dynamism into White's position after a period of strategic maneuvering.